Follow us on social media and please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any updates from our ALS experts.
Folks, look around you. See how many people you are getting to know. People here want to be here and help one another. So I just want to give you a little insight to something I learned this past week. I've been looking at other webinars myself. And the other day, Addie Barkin, I was listening to him and he came up with something that I didn't think about before. He said, hope is not passive. He said, hope is the hammer that we use to break the glass on the alarm that sends us into action. Now, folks, we think sometimes that we are out of action, but we are not. ALS is a disease we might have, but it's not us. And we have more power than we imagine if we say so. So any way that you can contribute any little morsel to anybody here you see tonight, or people around the world, because this will be viewed by people around the world. It's very important that we all come together and share our little pieces of the puzzle. And with that, Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, McFinn. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our Everything ALS Wednesday webinar series. We are so excited to always bring you the experts directly to your living room. I'm Lisa Deegan, and I'm part of the Everything ALS team. My younger brother had ALS, and each member of our team has personally been affected by this disease. So our goal really is to provide you all with what we didn't have while going through our journeys. Tonight, we look forward to an evening in education on the latest ALS researcher from one of our favorite renowned ALS experts, Dr. Richard Bedlack from Duke University, to present on Clenbuterol for ALS findings from an open label trial. Following the presentation, Dr. Dwight Colburl from Duke University will be joining us for the Q&A. After the presentation is finished, we are going to open up to a non-recorded private session to meet and connect with members of our community, talk about what's on your mind, or just have a safe place to listen and be surrounded by others in our community. Before we get started, please consider signing up for our Voice Project to help end ALS. With the help of everyone, we can bring citizen-driven research along with data technology and science to help accelerate treatments. So visit everythingals.org/research to learn more and sign up today. It only takes about 5 to 10 minutes a week, and you just need to be 18 and older. So I also wanted to share with everyone, McFinn and I started a new podcast for Everything ALS, and it's called Stories and Innovations in ALS. And you can catch this on Spotify and our YouTube channel and also our website. So basically, this is really just sharing stories of people who've been affected by ALS and also the efforts of those who are working super hard to help care for those with ALS and also find a cure for this devastating disease. So we only have a couple of episodes posted on Spotify, but we have about 17 to be released that are already recorded and a wonderful pipeline of future speakers. And you could catch Dr. Bedlack's interview, which was awesome. And you can just hear about how hard he's working and how passionate he is to help others. So please catch that, and I'll post it in our chat. But now for tonight, let's get to it. Dr. Bedlack. He is currently a professor of neurology at Duke University and the director and the creator of the Duke ALS Clinic. In his 22 years of experience, he's seen thousands of patients living with ALS, and he is not only well known for his very keen sense of style, he's published over 130 ALS articles. He received many, many grants and awards. He's participated in clinical trials. He's leading the ALSUntangled program. He's leading the ALS Reversals program and co-founded the ALS Clinical Research Learning Institute. So now please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Bedlack. We appreciate all the work you do for ALS and your dedication to always sharing it with our community. Thank you, Dr. B. And welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be invited back, and just want to echo something that McFinn said in the beginning, the importance of hope, the power of hope. It's something that I learned very early in my career. And I've got a story you can ask me about later if you're interested. I think I might have actually told it on the podcast, but happy to tell it again. And it's really one of the reasons I continue to speak so often and do so many of these webinars. I just think it's so important to continue to promote a hopeful message about this disease. I'm very hopeful. And tonight I get to tell you about something that I've been working on for the past couple of years, which is an open label pilot trial of a drug called Clenbuterol for people with ALS. And so this is the outline of my talk tonight. It's going to be a fairly short talk. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I'll explain to you what this drug is, why I decided to study it for ALS, what the design of our Capel family funded Duke trial looked like and why we chose those design features. And then I'll share the results of the study with you because it's now done, fully analyzed and ready for publication. We'll talk about who got into the study, what they look like. We'll talk about the safety and tolerability of this drug, and we'll talk about the effectiveness. And then I'll tell you what I'm planning as far as next steps for this compound go. So to start with, what is clenbuterol? Well, it's classified as a beta adrenergic receptor agonist, or beta agonist, which is used to treat asthma in many countries around the world. It is not used for asthma in the United States. In fact, it's not FDA approved for any indication, but it is safe and mostly well tolerated in many human trials in many different diseases that occur around the world. And if you're an American sports fan, you may have heard of this because your favorite athlete may have been suspended for testing positive for clenbuterol, abbreviated CLEN in the sporting world. Now, why would athletes want to use this asthma drug? Well, one of the many interesting things that this drug does is binds to beta adrenergic receptors in muscle. And as a result of that, increases protein synthesis in muscle cells, with the net result being that muscles get bigger and stronger. That's cheating in sports, but it's exactly what we want to have happen in diseases like ALS. And it turns out there's many other possible mechanisms by which this drug could help a person with ALS. It's neuroprotective. It improves something called neuromuscular transmission, which is the ability of nerves to talk to muscles. And it reduces inflammation in the brain and spinal cord, what we call neuroinflammation. The other reasons to consider studying this for ALS are that first, 15 years ago, somebody gave this drug to our mouse model of ALS. So as many of you know, one of the first models of ALS was to insert an abnormal gene, a mutation in a gene called SOD1 into a mouse. And that mouse does get some features of ALS. It gets progressive weakness and it has shortened survival. And it's something that we've learned a lot from. We've tested a lot of drugs in this mouse model. Unfortunately, most have not translated into people. But for what it's worth, somebody studied clenbuterol in that model and it worked. It preserved motor function and prolonged survival. But what was even more impressive to me was that 15 years ago, an Italian neurologist gave this drug to 16 patients in his clinic. It's not really a clinical trial. It's more of what I would call a case series because there wasn't any control group. But what happened to these 16 people was pretty extraordinary. And you can see one of the tables from his paper in this slide. So the columns are the different time points in the study. Time 0 is the average for each one of those outcome measures at the start of this exposure to clenbuterol. Time 1 is 3 months into clenbuterol exposure, and time 2 is 6 months into clenbuterol exposure. And let me call your attention to first this row, UL total myometry. That's an average of strength scores in the upper extremities in this group of 16 people. And you'll notice that it went up pretty significantly over the course of 6 months. LL is lower extremity myometry, which is a summation of muscle strength scores from the lower limbs. Once again, For the group of 16, on average, they got stronger over the course of 6 months. These are both clinically and statistically significant improvements in strength, which are seen across the whole average of this group of patients. That's very unusual in my experience to see any drug do something like that. And then finally, I'll call your attention to the row FVC, that's forced vital capacity. That's a measure of breathing. And once again, it was much better on average 6 months in for these 16 patients than it was when they started, clinically and statistically significant. And furthermore, this group used a really small dose of clenbuterol, just 20 micrograms 3 times a day. Many studies use much larger doses. And so all of this convinced us that we wanted to do our own study of clenbuterol. First thing we had to do is find funding. And happily, there was a family, the Capel family, which donated all the money for this particular study. Next, I had to find some collaborators, and my main collaborator was Dr. Dwight Coble, who's a Duke physician who's actually had experience using clenbuterol in other trials in kids and young adults that have a type of muscular dystrophy called Pompe's disease. I also found a statistician at Duke named Michael Lutz. Then we had to decide what this study was going to look like. And for those of you that have heard me speak before, you know that I often try to design a different type of clinical trial. I know that most clinical trials that come from pharmaceutical companies look a certain way. They have certain rules, they have certain design features, and that's fine. There's reasons for those. But I think it's important to offer different kinds of studies, studies that people who can't get into those studies can get into, studies that people who don't want to do those kinds of studies can get into. And that's what I tried to do here. So this study was fairly widely inclusive. It didn't have any exclusions for disease duration. No matter how long you had ALS, you could be in this study. It didn't have any exclusions for the use of any breathing devices. So some studies will exclude people that are using BiPAP or trilogies. This is a list of all the inclusion criteria, and it looks pretty long, but not really compared to your typical pharmaceutical company sponsored study. There's some things that we simply had to have in here. For example, you have to be able to read and understand the consent form. If you're sexually active, you have to be willing to use contraception or abstinence. If you're a female of childbearing age, you have to have a pregnancy test. These are things that we wouldn't be able to get through an IRB if they weren't in here. If you're going to take riluzole or Radicava, you had to be on a stable dose before you started this. You had to have some degree of remaining function. And the reason that that's in there was, you know, we hoped that clenbuterol would slow down the progression of ALS. So we have to have something to be able to measure a decline if we're going to say that this slows the progression. And there's also some contraindications to this drug. For example, you couldn't have tried this before and had a bad side effect. You couldn't have certain heart problems or seizure disorder or hyperthyroidism or pheochromocytoma. You couldn't be on certain drugs that interact with clenbuterol. So that's why the list is longer than you might expect. We decided to have 25 people with ALS participate in this study. Why did we pick that number? Well, first of all, that's what we could afford. Every new person that we decide to admit raises the budget. The other thing is that that's the number that our statistician told us was enough to detect a large slowing in ALS progression. We decided to make this an open label study. That means that everybody who participated got the real drug right from the start. Now, what are you going to use as controls if you do that? Well, the participants in this study served as their own controls. We compared their progression on clenbuterol to how they were progressing for the entire time before they started the drug. Why did we do that? Well, first, we know that there's a lot of variability in progression between different patients. So that's a big problem if you're going to do a small study. You could wind up with a huge imbalance between your control group and your treatment group. The other is that we know there's some people who just don't like placebo-controlled trials, understandably. And so we want to have some different options for them in our clinic. These are nice things from a patient perspective, but understand that they do have some downsides from a scientific side. So First, there isn't any kind of blinding here. Everybody knows that they're getting the real drug. The patients know it, the raters know it, and that creates a potential for some biases. And then the other is that the progression of ALS within an individual patient is not always linear. And so it's possible that they might have just naturally slowed down in terms of their progression for the 6 months that they were on Clenbuterol. But I will say it would be an awfully strange coincidence if that happened to everybody in a study. It might happen to a few patients, but it would be odd for it to happen to everybody simultaneously. We decided to dose this a little bit higher than the Italian neurologist gave his patients. We started at 40 micrograms daily, and we ramped it up to 80 micrograms twice a day. Remember, the Italian started at 10 micrograms 3 times a day and ramped it up to 20 micrograms 3 times a day. Why did we do that? Well, Dr. Coble, my collaborator, had experience with this drug at higher doses, and it seemed to be very safe and very well tolerated in his patients. And we hoped that by pushing the dose, we would be able to see even greater benefits than what the Italian showed. Outcome measures were pretty standard for an ALS trial. We had some safety labs. We looked at adverse events, like what bad things happened to people who were in the study. We looked at tolerability, how many people dropped out. We looked at the ALS functional rating scale, which is the main outcome measure used in just about every ALS clinical trial. As you know, it's 12 questions. Each question is asking about a different function. So there's a question about speaking and about swallowing and about dressing and about walking and a few questions about breathing. And each one of these questions is scored by the patient from 0, which means there's no function there at all, to 4, which means the function is normal. Typical rate of progression on this scale, if you looked at 1,000 patients, would be about 1 point per month lost. We also looked at the breathing capacity, the forced vital capacity, FVC, specifically the percent predicted. And in both of these outcome measures, we were measuring a slope, the slope of progression before versus the slope on Clenbuterol treatment. And then we also wanted to look at muscle strength testing, myometry. And so we looked at hand grip dynamometry. So you'd actually squeeze something and there'd be a little dial to tell you how much force you could squeeze with your hand. And we looked at myometry in the arms and legs, which is you take a device and you hold it up against a muscle. So say, for example, you want to measure the strength of the deltoid, you would actually hold the device on top of the arm like this and ask the person to resist and see how much force they could resist the machine to. And we did composite scores of the upper and lower extremities, just like the Italian group did. There was no control group for those because it's hard to know what people started at. So you can't easily calculate a slope before the trial started. Those were just exploratory. We tried to make this as easy as we could for people to participate in. So there were only 4 in-person visits. The other visits were all telephone visits. And you can kind of see the schedule of what was done at each visit. So most of the outcome measures were done at screening, week 4, week 12, and then week 24. And those were the in-person visits. So the timeline, we opened the study in February of 2020. Looking back on it, you probably couldn't have picked a worse time to open up a clinical trial, but we didn't know we were about to have a worldwide pandemic that still is not over. So I'm actually pretty impressed that we enrolled as quickly as we did. Our last participant enrolled in September and completed the study in February. And so our enrollment rate was about 3.8 patients per site per month. So to give you some perspective, most ALS trials enroll 1 to 2 patients per site per month. I think that's a pretty good enrollment rate when you consider that we actually couldn't enroll any new patients for over 3 months. And that's because, like many institutions, ours just wouldn't allow new patients to be enrolled in research studies in the early days of the pandemic. The pandemic affected us in a couple of other ways. First, we weren't able to do breathing measurements for several months. And that was because Duke wouldn't allow it. We didn't know whether COVID could be transmitted by people doing breathing tests. And then finally, we did have one person drop out because of the pandemic. He just didn't feel like it was safe for him to travel to continue to get measured in the clinic. So this is what the patients in this study look like. It's sort of pretty typical in terms of demographics of most research studies, age about 60, slightly more men than women. But what was different here was the duration of ALS. So on average, these folks had ALS for more than 3 years when they enrolled in the study. And as you probably know, most trials exclude people who've had ALS for 3 years or more. So, I mean, I'm proud of the fact that this is a different looking group. I think it's important that we study different looking groups in our trials. They were progressing pretty slowly, even though they'd had ALS for more than 3 years. Most of them still had 34 points on their ALS functional rating scale and had a forced vital capacity of about 77% predicted. And most of these folks were taking riluzole. None of them were taking radicava. So let's first talk a little bit about safety and tolerability. Like just about every other study of clenbuterol, we didn't see any worrisome safety signals. None of our safety labs changed in any way that was concerning. We did have 2 serious adverse events where people had to be hospitalized, but neither was related to the drug. One person nearly drowned, and another person had a pulmonary embolus, which unfortunately is a little bit more common in ALS than it is in people without ALS. We had a fair number of non-serious adverse events though. In fact, 24 out of 25 patients had at least one non-serious adverse event. And 13 people actually dropped out of the study before 6 months because of side effects. The most common side effects being cramps, tremors, insomnia, and muscle stiffness. So now let's talk a little bit about effectiveness. There's 2 ways to look at effectiveness in any study. First, you can look at the people that finished the study. This is called a per protocol analysis. So we had 11 out of 25 people who started who finished the entire 6-month study. All 11 patients had a slower ALS FRSR progression on treatment compared to how they were doing before they started treatment, every single patient. One person actually had an ALS FRSR slope of 0 on clenbuterol, meaning they didn't change at all for 6 months. And 4 actually had a positive slope, meaning they were regaining points they had lost. And so using this per protocol analysis, we found overall a 70% slowing in ALS FRSR progression on clenbuterol compared to how people were doing before they started. And that's obviously highly significant statistically and clinically. Now, another way to analyze data is by something called intention to treat. Some people would say it's not fair to only look at the people that finished the study because those were probably the best. They were doing the best, and that's not an accurate picture of what would happen in the real world. And so a true intention to treat analysis analyzes every single patient who was enrolled in the study. Well, we couldn't really figure out how to do that because we were calculating slopes, and I don't know how you calculate a slope with only one data point on clenbuterol. So we did something called a modified intention to treat. Everybody that started in the trial and had at least 2 data points on clenbuterol was included in this analysis. So that was 20 people as far as the ALS FRSR. And out of the 20, 15 had a slower ALS FRSR progression on treatment compared to how they were doing before. And overall, there was about a 37% slowing on treatment, which again is statistically, and I would argue probably clinically significant. As far as forced vital capacity, the numbers are smaller, again, because the pandemic prevented us from doing this measurement for a while. But we still found 16 people who had at least 2 data points on clenbuterol. And the results there were even more striking, and you can see them in the bar graph. There was about a 90% slowing in FVC progression on treatment compared to how people were doing prior to treatment, which again is obviously statistically and clinically significant. And last but not least, I'll just show you some of the myometry graphs. They all looked very similar to this. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the maximum voluntary contraction in the hand grip test for all the 11 people who completed the study. And on the right-hand side, this is the myometry scores from, I believe it was elbow flexion during the study. Again, we focused on the 11 people that finished. What I wanted you to see here is there's a lot of noise. People are doing differently, but it's pretty clear that some people in this trial regained a significant amount of their strength over 6 months on Clenbuterol. And again, in my experience as an ALS doctor, it's pretty unusual to see anybody regain a lot of strength in a clinical trial. So to conclude, I'll tell you that this is a flawed study. I know when I present this later this year at meetings, it's going to be criticized. It's very small. It's not randomized. It's not blinded. It's not placebo controlled. And we had, unfortunately, a fairly large dropout rate. But in spite of all that, I think the data are pretty encouraging. And I think they support the previous work on Clenbuterol, the animal model work, and the case series from Italy. I really do think they suggest a benefit from this drug on ALS progression. We would not have been able to do this study without a lot of help, the Capel family's donation, the collaborators at Duke, Dr. Coble and Dr. Lutz, and of course, most importantly, the time and effort of all the people that participated and their families. So what do I plan to do next? Well, I'm going to be presenting this at the NEALS meeting. I'm going to be presenting it at the International Symposium on Motor Neuron Disease. Dwight and Dr. Lutz and I are working on the draft of the paper, which we hope to get published in the next few months. But of course, we would like to take this further. We would actually like to plug this into a much larger, more traditional study that would convince more scientists and possibly even a regulatory group like the FDA that this works. And so one idea that I had is that maybe someday this could be plugged into the platform trial. It's a pretty big jump in funding from what we did to get into the platform trial though. Just to give you an idea, our study costs about $200,000. To get a drug into the platform trial is about 15 million. So I will stop there and I will take some questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Bedlack. I think with the 70% of slowing progression, it sounds incredibly promising. And I hope you can study this on a larger population. And it just sounds really promising. So thank you for presenting that. Do we have Dr. Coble here to help with our Q&A, or will you just be addressing the questions?
Okay, well, let me see what I can do here. Thank you.
My name is Sarah. I'm one of the Everything ALS team members. Myself, along with James, will be kind of moderating this question portion. The first one being, can you give a small mechanism of action for Clenbuterol?
Yeah. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it's binding to beta adrenergic receptors. Those are the same receptors in the body where epinephrine binds. And those receptors turn out to be in a lot of different places in the body that may be relevant to ALS. So I guess that first picture didn't come up, but there are receptors for this drug on muscle. And when Clenbuterol binds to those receptors, it actually stimulates protein synthesis in muscles, which makes muscles get bigger and stronger. And there are receptors in the brain and the spinal cord, which it looks like may primarily be on immune cells. So this could modify neuroinflammation. It looks like this may be able to stimulate better communication between nerves and muscles, which what is called neuromuscular transmission. So there are multiple mechanisms of action. The easiest one to understand is its effect on muscle, and I think that's why athletes take it.
Hi, Dr. Bedlack. I'm James. I'll be doing the other portion of the Q&A, and just to kick it off, one of the trials listed exclusions was hyperthyroidism, I believe. And for those who don't know, it's the overactive thyroid. Why was hyperthyroidism an exclusion, and was hypothyroidism also a concern as well?
Yeah, so I don't know if Dwight's out there, but Dwight, if you are, chime in since you've got so much more experience with this. But I believe the reason is that this drug actually does a lot of the same things that hyperthyroidism does. For example, tachycardia, palpitations. So the combination of this drug plus that problem would be probably too much and probably unsafe. And that's what a lot of those exclusions were, things that are known to be problems for people that take Clenbuterol or albuterol. which is another drug in the same class. So again, people often complain of palpitations, and they do get tachycardia on this, which people with hyperthyroidism also get.
Can you please explain why the choice was to use a brand that had 30% curcumin instead of straight curcumin in it for the trial?
Well, I think that person is asking about a completely different trial. So clenbuterol is not curcumin. I think that person may be asking about another trial that I have underway of a product which is called theracurmin. And theracurmin is a form of curcumin. It's curcumin in nanoparticles, which makes it water soluble. And just as an aside, I'll hopefully someday come back and talk about that trial when it's done. But the reason we chose that product is because that company had done some really nice pharmacokinetic studies to show that that exact formulation, it changes the microbiome, it gets absorbed into blood, and it probably even gets absorbed into brain. And there's a lot of forms of curcumin that don't do that. So, but that's something completely different. That has nothing to do with clenbuterol.
Next question is, I know you're going to present your findings with this, but what phase technically is this trial in now?
So the study that I just did would be referred to as a pilot trial. Some people might call it a phase 2A study. You know, a very early trial in people with the condition of interest. So the first thing that was done in Italy would have been called a case series. This was the first clinical trial of clenbuterol for people with ALS. And again, it was very small and not randomized, blinded, or placebo controlled, which are kind of like the gold standards that scientists look to for clinical trials.
In the inclusion criteria, were both participants with sporadic and familial ALS included?
Yes.
Was there any change or results differing between the two groups?
You know, I haven't actually looked at that. I don't think anyone that was in this trial had familial ALS, but it's a great question. I'll have to go back and look in the data.
The next question is primarily about the controls of the study. So if the patients served as their own controls, how is the effectiveness of the drug measured against other individual factors, i.e. other medications, individual environmental factors, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, we asked people not to start disease-modifying therapies like riluzole or edaravone at the same time that they started this study. We wanted them to be on a stable dose. We asked people not to take other products that were in clinical trials while they were in this 6 months of clenbuterol. And honestly, I mean, that's about the best you can do. I mean, you can't make someone's life exactly the same every day like you could a mouse in a cage. I mean, people are they're gonna be different. They're gonna get different exposures. Their diets are probably gonna change over time. So yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's another one of the drawbacks of doing a study this way. But again, we did it on purpose for the reasons that I outlined. One of the big ones being, you know, in my clinic, I typically have 3 or 4 trials to offer my patients. And most of them are pharmaceutical company sponsored trials. Nothing wrong with them. It's great that we have those options, but there are many people in my clinic who don't qualify or don't want to do those kinds of trials because of their design. And so I am always going to try to create an alternative type of trial that I can offer my patients.
Wonderful. The next question kind of combines a few. We have a lot of people in the chat asking if they are able to get clenbuterol on their own. What is recommended dosing or potential? Would you recommend the dosing that was done in the trial? And for those outside the United States, is there restrictions on availability?
Yeah, so this would be outside the United States, this would be referred to as an off-label prescription. So let's say in the United States, somebody wanted to take ceftriaxone for their ALS, even though we studied it and it didn't seem to work, but somebody said, I have a theory, I want to try this. I can write a prescription for ceftriaxone for anything that I want. Now it might not get paid for, and people are noticing that with sodium phenylbutyrate. You know, as people try to replicate the AMX0035 components, they're asking for prescriptions for sodium phenylbutyrate. And many of us are giving those prescriptions with the caution that insurance is probably going to latch onto this because it's expensive, and they're probably going to say they're not paying for it for ALS because it's not indicated. So outside the United States, that may be what happens if a person tries to do it. Inside the United States, this is not FDA approved for anything. It's not a supplement that's sold on Amazon. There's no pharmacy that has this. But the FDA on its website has something called the Personal Importation Policy. And I would encourage you to take a look at that with your doctor and see if you agree with the interpretation of it that I have, which is that a person with a tough disease like ALS, who doesn't have a lot of good therapeutic options, can import a drug from another country for their own use to try to treat their disease. And that's where this would fall. So it is possible, in my opinion, to legally import clenbuterol for a person's own use. You can't buy a bunch of this and sell it out of your trunk. That would be illegal. Now, this process, as I understand it, can be a little tricky to navigate on your own. So for example, the way it would work is you'd have to find a doctor in another country that would write the prescription, get the medicine, and ship it here. And if it got snagged in customs, you would have to convince them that you were using the personal importation policy. Now, the good news is there's a company out there whose entire business model is to navigate this and similar policies around the world. The company is called the Social Med Work. It was actually started by Jamie Haywood, who started Patients Like Me. And so many of my own patients now have asked for this. I've given them a prescription. I've given them a letter saying, I agree that this is a reasonable thing to try. I'm going to supervise them. The patient has agreed to me that they're only going to use this themselves. They're not going to sell it. And they take those documents to the Social Med Work, and the Social Med Work gets the medication into the country for them. Now, there's a charge for that, but it is a way to do it. It's just that you would need to have a doctor who would write the prescription here, give you a letter of support, and then you'd have to take those things to the Social Med Work. I will also say there are some doctors who don't agree with me that this pathway is legit. All I can tell you is what I'm reading on the FDA's own website and the fact that I have done this with other patients and not had a problem. So.
Actually, very fascinating to know just in general that that's the channel it goes through.
One more, someone asked
yeah,
about the dose. I wanted to comment on that before I forget. So if I ever am lucky enough to get to study this again, and right now for the patients in my clinic who are asking for it, I'm using the dosing regimen that the Italian neurologists use. I think that was looking back on it, probably one of our mistakes. You know, we had good reasons why we tried to push the dose, but I think that's probably part of why we had some tolerability issues and a lot more dropouts than we expected, is that this dose was too high for people with ALS. So I would go back, to what the Italians used, which was 10 micrograms 3 times a day for the first week, and then 20 micrograms 3 times a day after that.
On that same line of thinking, were there, and I know you, to make a baseline for control, you told people to stop taking certain supplements and drugs, but were there any drugs or supplements that interacted with clenbuterol during the trial?
Not that we were able to pinpoint. Now, remember, we did have those inclusion-exclusion criteria, and that's part of why I put those in this talk, was because I figured there might be people who wanted to try this. If I had ALS and I was going to try this, the first thing I would do is go down that list and make sure I didn't have any of those medical conditions and wasn't taking any of those medications that interact with clenbuterol, because I think you can run into problems in that case. So, I think that's the one exception, is that it's possible there could be interactions, but we screened for the drugs that we were most worried about.
That's very helpful. Thank you. The next question is, why is the ability to swallow always an exclusion?
So we were not entirely sure about what would happen if this pill was crushed. Now, since we did our trial, we have learned that there are people who are crushing this and putting it in their feeding tubes, and apparently they're not having any problems with it. So I think if we did this again, that probably wouldn't be an exclusion, but we were erring on the side of safety given what we knew in January of 2010 or 2020 when we were putting this trial together.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that might be our last question that was in the chat or mailed in. I want to thank you personally for coming and speaking with us. This has been very informative. I know a lot of us will definitely be looking forward to the future, and hope that funding can come in quickly so that we can study Clenbuterol some more. And we look forward to getting to speak with you about other future trials. And I know we've discussed briefly the curcumin trial, so maybe when that readout comes, we can have you back again. Because I know we all really appreciate everything that you're doing for the ALS community, as well as being so willing to speak and come participate with groups like Everything ALS and others. So thank you again, Dr. Bedlack, and we so support your research, and will continue to do so in the future.
Well, thank you for these kind words, and I definitely look forward to coming back in 2022 with a lot more results from studies that I have going on. The Theracurmin, the microbiome, some of the ALS reversals work. There's a lot of exciting things happening that I can't wait to see the final results on. So,
Absolutely.
Well, we're getting a lot of thank yous. Great session. Thank you, Dr. Bedlack. Lots of chat. Lots of people putting in the chat, thanking you so much. So you guys, if you want to catch Dr. Bedlack on our podcast, check it out on Spotify. It's called Stories and Innovations in ALS, and it's on our website, everythingals.org, and also our YouTube channel, Everything ALS. So thanks again, Dr. Bedlack. That was so informative, and all of the questions got answered, which we love. So now we're gonna
Lisa, I'm getting a message that Priscilla had her hand up. I don't know if she was able to message into the chat for a question. I just don't want to lose her in case she has something to ask.
Thanks, James.
No problem.
Okay. Let's see, we've got.
Is it so, Priscilla? I'm gonna ask you to unmute. Let me know if that works.
Thank you. I asked my neurologist about a derivative of clenbuterol called Clenbuterol, which you can get online, because I had looked at Clenbuterol and realized I couldn't order it, but there is this derivative. And my neurologist said he didn't know anything about it, and I should ask Dr. Bedlack. So that's what I'm doing.
yeah, I have actually not heard of that compound before. I will take your link and see what I can find out about it, see if I can find a structure and see if it looks anything like the structure of clenbuterol. You know, one thing to be careful of is that, I don't have to tell you, I'm sure, there's a lot of strange things on the internet. There's a lot of products that are out there that they sound like something else. Like, I understand somebody was actually selling a supplement called NU9 recently. Nothing at all related to what the group at Northwestern was studying, but just trying to capitalize on the excitement of that research. So if you send me the link, I'll do my best to find out about it for you.
Or you guys can always feel free to send us email to info@everythingals.org, and we can always reach out and get your questions answered if they weren't answered tonight.